The sky over the Rhine Valley erupted in cannon fire at 0914 hours on March 2, 1945. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler rolled his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G14 into a climbing turn, targeting what should have been easy prior, lone American bomber trailing smoke from its No. 3 engine. His finger tightened on the trigger. The distance closed to 400 meters, 300-250. Then the sky went mad. Luftwaffe combat reports. March 1945. Bundesarchiv. The crippled bomber B-17 Flying Fortress suddenly sprouted escorts from every direction. Not the expected 2 or 3, 8, 12, 16. P-51 Mustangs materialized from cloud cover above. Below, flanking positions, Stigler hadn't even checked. They moved with unnatural coordination, scissors maneuvers executed so precisely, they seemed choreographed. Stigler's wingman screamed through the radio, a warning cut short by the hammering of Browning machine guns. The Messerschmitt beside him disintegrated into flame and tumbling metal. Stigler snap-rolled right, dove through his own altitude, pulled 7 Gs until his vision tunneled grey, and somehow when he landed at his forward airstrip 17 minutes later, his hands still shook on the control column. They fight like they share one brain, he scrawled in his logbook that evening, the ink smudged by sweat, still drying on his palm. Personal diary. Franz Stigler collection. Translated, this wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't what the intelligence briefings promised. Rewind 3 years. Summer 1942. The Luftwaffe owned the European sky. German fighter doctrine, forged in Spain and perfected over Poland, France, and Russia, emphasized individual, ace-culture aggressive, opportunistic killers flying loose formations with massive freedom to hunt. Experts like Adolf Galland, Werner Mulders, and Erich Hartmann racked up kill counts in the hundreds. They flew by instinct, aggression, superior training, and aircraft that, in early war years, outperformed nearly everything the Allies fielded. U.S. Army Air Force's Historical Studies, 1943. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could outclimb and outdive the early P-40s and P-39s. The Focke-Wulf FW-1090 boasted superior roll rate and firepower. German pilots averaged 350 hours of training before combat assignments, more than double their American counterparts in 1942. Luftwaffe personnel records. Bundeswehr. When the first American heavy bombers appeared over occupied Europe in August 1942, Luftwaffe commanders studied reconnaissance photos with bemused confidence. The Americans would learn, they assumed, the same lessons the British had already paid for in blood. They were wrong, but they wouldn't understand why for nearly 2 years, the 8th Air Force arrived in England piecemeal through late 1942 and early 1943. Bomber groups without sufficient escorts, cruised with inadequate combat formation training, flying into the teeth of the most experienced fighter force on Earth. Early results confirmed every German assumption. On August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Drakensberg mission saw 60 B-17s shot down out of 300. 76 dispatched, a catastrophic 16% loss rate. 8th Air Force mission reports. August 1943, Luftwaffe pilots celebrated. German newspapers crowed. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring reassured Hitler that American daylight bombing was unsustainable, that the Reich's industries were safe, that the Luftwaffe remained supreme. The math seemed irrefutable. At current attrition rates, the Americans would run out of bombers and trained crews before Germany ran out of fighters and pilots. But something was shifting beneath the surface, something German intelligence officers couldn't see in their reconnaissance photos or intercept transcripts, something that wouldn't show up in kill ratios or aircraft performance specifications. The American pilots were changing, not incrementally, fundamentally. They were learning faster than any air force in history, synthesizing combat experience into new tactical systems, communication protocols, and training pipelines at industrial scale. U.S. Strategic Air Force's Historical Studies, 1944. More critically, they were abandoning the very culture of individual heroism that defined Luftwaffe excellence. Where German doctrine celebrated the ace, American doctrine eliminated him. Where German fighters hunted alone or in pairs, American squadrons began moving as unified weapon systems. Where German pilots trusted instinct and aggression, American pilots trusted each other, their radios, and a flood of technological advantages their enemy didn't yet comprehend. By February 1944, Luftwaffe after-action reports began noting disturbing patterns. American fighter formations no longer broke apart under attack. Bomber boxes maintained discipline even under sustained assault. Most unsettling, American pilots seemed to know where German fighters were before visual contact, anticipating bounce attempts, repositioning to counter altitude advantages, calling out threats their eyes couldn't possibly see. Luftwaffe intelligence assessment, February 1944. Translated. Experienced German pilots, survivors of hundreds of sorties over Russia and the Channel, started refusing missions, not from cowardice, from mathematics. The Americans were simply everywhere, all the time, coordinated across dozens of aircraft with mechanical precision. Major Heinz Bauer, credited with over 200 kills, landed after a mission near Osnabrück in March 1944 with cannon shells through his left wing and hydraulic fluid streaming from his undercarriage. He gathered his squadron in the briefing room and spoke words that would have been unthinkable. 18 months earlier, "We are no longer hunting. We are being hunted." Luftwaffe squadron records, March 1944. Bundesarchiv. What had changed? The planes had not fundamentally. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang were excellent aircraft, but not supernaturally superior to the FW-190 or late model Bf-109s in 1 vs 1 engagements. The bombers were the same B-17s and B-24s that had bled over. The American pilots weren't suddenly more naturally talented than their German counterparts, but they had become something else entirely, something the Luftwaffe's ace culture couldn't recognize because it had no equivalent in German experience. The Americans had become a network, and the weapon that made them a network was invisible, ubiquitous, and devastatingly effective in ways that transcended simple aircraft performance. The weapon wasn't a gun, it was a voice. The secret lived in a black box bolted beneath the instrument panel of every American fighter. By mid-1944, a VHF radio set, designated -522 Seychelles rupees, weighing 31 pounds, capable of transmitting voice communications across 4 channels in the 100 to 156 MHz frequency range with crystal clear fidelity at ranges exceeding 50 miles under ideal conditions. Technical Manual TM11-242, 1944. 2 German pilots, still shouting over static, choked, high-frequency sets with 15-mile maximum range and constant atmospheric interference. The difference was apocalyptic. American fighter pilots didn't just communicate, they orchestrated. The -522 Seychelles rupees represented a revolution engineered not by military scientists but by civilian corporations racing against time. Engineers at Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later Motorola, had pioneered FM frequency modulation radio technology through the late 1930s, solving the static and interference problems that plagued traditional amplitude modulation sets. Motorola Engineering Report, 1943. When war came, the U.S. Army Signal Corps contracted rapid production scaling. By 1944, factories in Chicago were manufacturing 4,000 units monthly, each hand-calibrated to exacting specifications by technicians, many of them women recruited from electronics schools and technical colleges who tested frequency stability, audio clarity, and durability under simulated combat vibration. War Production Board Report, 1944. The radios shipped to England in reinforced crates, installed by maintenance crews working 16-hour shifts at bases across East Anglia, wired into electrical systems of P-51s, still smelling of fresh paint and engine oil. The radios enabled transformed aerial warfare from individualized dueling into something closer to telepathy. On January 11, 1944, over Osh, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group demonstrated the new reality with surgical precision. His squadron of 16 P-51B Mustangs escorted a bomber formation through a coordinated assault by over 40 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 3. In the old paradigm, the paradigm still governing Luftwaffe tactics, this would have devolved into a chaotic furball. Individual combats scattered across 30 cubic miles of sky. Victories determined by pilot skill and aircraft performance in isolated engagements. Instead, Gentile's squadron remained connected. 8th Air Force Mission Report, January 11, 1944. Bogies 11 o'clock high. Coming down. His number 3 called voice calm, precise. Distance and altitude, estimated from training drilled into muscle memory. Roger Falcon Leet taking the bounce. White flight, cover the bombers. Red flight, swing wide right, cut off their escape. Gentile transmitted, his words reaching every pilot simultaneously. No delays, no misunderstandings. The German fighters dove into what they expected, scattered defenders reacting individually. Predictable, exploitable. What they found instead was a prepositioned trap. White flight for P-51s remained, locked on the bomber box, refusing the bait. Red flight had already climbed into the sun, invisible. Positioning for the counterbounce German pilots wouldn't see coming until Browning tracers ripped through their canopies. Gentile's own flight met the dive head-on, not defensively but as a coordinated wall, forcing the Germans to commit to beam attacks that exposed them to red flight slashing descent. Within 90 seconds, 7 Messerschmitts were falling, spinning, burning, pilots bailing out or riding their aircraft into the frozen earth below. The Americans lost 0 aircraft. 4th Fighter Group Combat Records, January 1944. German pilots who survived encounters like Oschersleben returned to their bases shaken and confused. Oberfeld Wilhelm Hoffmann, a veteran of over 150 missions, dictated a report that captured the bewilderment spreading through Luftwaffe squadrons. The Americans do not fight as individuals. You bounce one, and 3 more are already turning into your attack from positions you did not see them occupy. They speak to each other constantly. You hear it on the frequencies, sometimes calm voices coordinating like factory foremen directing an assembly line. We are the parts being assembled into wreckage. Luftwaffe Pilot Interrogation Report. February 1944. U.S. Army Intelligence. Translated. The comparison to factory work wasn't accidental. German pilots recognized industrial efficiency when it was killing them. The radios enabled micro-coordination impossible under previous technology. Flight leaders issued real-time tactical commands, altitudes, headings, throttle settings, attack sequences, escape vectors. Bomber formations called out fighter positions, flak concentrations, and damage assessments, feeding information instantly to escort commanders who adjusted coverage dynamically. Most devastatingly, American pilots adopted the finger for formation, 2 pairs flying abreast rather than the outdated 3-plane Vic that British had abandoned after paying thousands of lives to learn. Its flaws. RAF, Tactical Memorandum, 1941. Each pilot covered his wingman, each pair covered the other. The formation maximized situational awareness and mutual support while remaining flexible, enough to engage or evade without breaking communication. By March 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying missions with over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, all coordinated through layered radio networks managing altitudes, timing, rendezvous points, and threat responses across formations stretching from the English Channel to Berlin. 8th Air Force Operations Analysis. March 1944. German controllers listening to intercepts heard a symphony of calm professionalism, distance, altitude checks, fuel states, bandit warnings, all delivered in measured tones, even during combat that was tearing apart 1,000-horsepower fighters at 350 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe tried adapting. They couldn't. German industry was already strangling under strategic bombing and resource shortages. Upgrading radio equipment across thousands of fighters required production capacity, rare materials, and time the Reich no longer possessed. German war production statistics. 1,944 U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. More fundamentally, upgrading equipment wouldn't fix the cultural gap. German doctrine had spent 2 decades cultivating individual aggression and ace supremacy. American doctrine had spent 2 years industrializing teamwork. You couldn't retrofit culture with new radios. The culmination came on March 6, 1944. Big week missions targeting German aircraft production. Over 3,000 American sorties in 5 days, escorted by massed fighter sweeps coordinated with bomber streams through meticulous radio-controlled timing. 8th Air Force Historical Study. Big week, 1944. The Luftwaffe launched desperate interceptions, throwing every available fighter into battles over Brunswick, Oschersleben, Erkner, and Augsburg. The Americans shot down over 500 German aircraft in 5 days, while losing 260 bombers and 28 fighters, a kill ratio that would have been inconceivable 6 months earlier. But raw numbers obscured the deeper disaster. The Luftwaffe lost irreplaceable veteran pilotsmen with hundreds of hours and dozens of kills. The experten around whom squadron cohesion depended because American Coordination allowed focusing overwhelming force at decisive points. 8 P-51s could swarm a single FW-190 in seconds. Called in by wingman who spotted the enemy first, communicated instantly, and positioned for kill shots before the German pilot understood he'd been detected. Luftwaffe loss reports. March 1944. Bundesarchiv, General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, General of Fighters, stood in the operations room at Luftwaffe High Command, reviewing loss reports with mounting horror. He recognized what the numbers represented: institutional collapse. They have made the sky transparent, he reportedly told his staff officers in a moment of unguarded despair. The comment recorded in an aide's diary: "We fly into battles already lost because they see everything and communicate perfectly. We are fighting an opponent who has eliminated chance." Staff diary. Luftwaffe High Command, March 1944. Captured documents, translated, dramatized composite. The radios weren't just technology. They were doctrine made tangibly, physical manifestation of American industrial culture applied to warfare, where German military tradition emphasized hierarchy, honor, and individual glory. American engineers had built systems for mass coordination. The same nation that had perfected assembly lines, telephone networks, and corporate management structures had weaponized communication itself. And the pilots, many of them barely 20 years old, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, had embraced it instinctively, because teamwork and systematic process were already the water they swam in. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a phantom. American fighters appeared from nowhere, already positioned, already coordinated, executing attacks that seemed precognitive. The sky belonged to voices traveling at the speed of light, and the Germans were deaf. The strategic impact cascaded through every level of the European air war, with compound interest paid in blood and burning metal. By June 1944, as Allied forces stormed Normandy beaches, the Luftwaffe could muster barely 300 serviceable fighters over the entire invasion front, not from lack of aircraft in depots, but from the systematic destruction of pilot cadres throughout spring. Allied Expeditionary Air Force Intelligence Summary, June 1944. The radio-coordinated American fighter sweeps had accomplished what raw firepower alone never could. They had made training new pilots fatal. Luftwaffe flight schools were graduating, replacements with less than 120 hours total flight time, barely half the 1942 standard, because keeping them in training longer simply meant the Allies destroyed more experienced instructors in coordinated bounce attacks on training areas. Luftwaffe Training Command Report, May 1944. The Americans weren't just winning the immediate battles, they were exterminating the institution that produced future opposition. German ground forces felt the shift viscerally. Panzer columns that had relied on Luftwaffe air superiority since Poland now cowered under camouflage netting, moving only at night, hemorrhaging vehicles to Thunderbolt and Mustang attacks, coordinated through airborne controllers who directed fighters onto targets with conversational ease. Tank column, map reference, Golf 7, 12 vehicles, moving west en route Napoleon, a radio call requiring 8 seconds to transmit would bring 4 P-47s loaded with 5-inch rockets onto the target within 3 minutes. The 19th Tactical Air Command Operations Log, July 1944. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion in Normandy, recorded the psychological toll in his post-war memoir. "We learned to fear the empty sky more than the occupied one. When we saw no aircraft, we knew they were speaking to each other somewhere beyond the horizon, assembling to fall on us like a coordinated fist. The Americans had made the air itself into an enemy that watched and communicated, and never forgot where you were." Hans von Luck. Panzer Commander, 1989. The morale differential became a strategic weapon, as measurable as any bomb tonnage. American fighter pilots flew missions with the confidence of overwhelming systemic support, knowing that their wingmen would cover them, that their radios would summon help, that the entire apparatus of American industrial might was coordinating their survival. Luftwaffe pilots flew into skies they knew were surveilled, coordinated, and lethally efficient, aware that each mission reduced their statistical survival probability toward zero. Post-war psychological assessments of captured German pilots revealed clinical symptoms of learned helplessness, fatalism, reduced initiative, inability to trust squadron cohesion. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division, 1946. One interrogation report noted that a Luftwaffe pilot with 63 kills, an ace, by any measure refused to speculate on tactical improvements because tactics require communication, and communication requires technology we will never possess in sufficient quantity. The Americans have already won every future battle. Prisoner of war interrogation report. Pilot number 2847, August 1944. Classified until 1973, behind the front lines. The unsung architects of this dominance worked 16-hour shifts, maintaining the technological edge. Ground crews at English airfields, mechanics, radio technicians, armament specialists performed miracles of field maintenance, keeping SCR 5-2 sets operational despite mud, vibration, and combat damage. Technical Sergeant Dorothy Miller, one of thousands of women serving in Signal Corps repair depots, recalibrated over 1,400 radio sets during her 18-month deployment, testing each unit's frequency, stability, and audio clarity before certifying them for combat installation. Women's Army Corps Service Record. 832nd Signal Service Battalion, 1945. The engineers at Wright Field in Ohio continuously refined radio protocols, developing coded brevity terms and standardized callouts that reduced transmission time while increasing information density. Bounce for attack from above, bandit for enemy fighter, bingo for minimum fuel stator. Tactical vocabulary that became second nature to pilots, who transmitted amid 6G turns and cannon fire. Army Air Force's Tactical School Communication Doctrine, 1944. The Luftwaffe attempted countermeasures that ranged from desperate to delusional. German signals intelligence units tried jamming American frequencies, but the Americans simply switched channels. The SCR 522's Fortunal capability rendered single-frequency jamming pointless. Luftwaffe Signals Intelligence Report, April 1944, captured. German fighters experimented with radio silence to avoid intercept triangulation, which only isolated them further, rendering them blind and mute, while American pilots coordinated around them like wolves around scattered prey. Some German units tried mimicking American radio discipline and coordination, but without the equipment density, training infrastructure, or cultural foundation, the efforts collapsed into confusion. Teaching individual hunters to think like hive minds proved impossible on timelines measured in weeks, when the institutional transformation required years. By autumn 1944, the air war had effectively ended as a contest between peers. The Luftwaffe retained individual pilots of extraordinary skill, men who would survive to claim hundreds of kills against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, but in the West, they were flying into an opponent that had transcended individual skill as the measure of victory. The sky over Germany had become an American communications network that happened to include explosives. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, articulated the transformation in a letter to his wife that November. "We don't dogfight anymore, not really. We manage airspace. We coordinate altitudes. We direct firepower through radio calls the way a conductor directs an orchestra." The Germans still have brave men and fast planes, but bravery and speed cannot defeat a system that sees everything, communicates instantly, and concentrates. Force before you know your targeted. Personal correspondence. Hubert Zemke collection. November 1944. The lessons reverberated through post-war military development with the force of revealed truth. The U.S. Air Force institutionalized radio coordination as foundational doctrine, investing billions in communication systems that evolved through Korea, Vietnam, and into the networked warfare of the Gulf War and beyond. The E-3 Sentry AWACS, airborne radar and communication platform coordinating hundreds of aircraft across thousands of square miles, represented the ultimate expression of principles first proven over the Rhine in 1944. U.S. Air Force Historical Study. AWACS Development, 1982. Modern fighter pilots train in simulators, emphasizing communication protocols and networked situational awareness as rigorously as stick-and-rudder skills. Because the institutional memory persists, technology that enables perfect coordination defeats superior individual performance every single time. The Germans understood too late. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, reflecting on the air war during his post-war interrogation, provided the eulogy for Luftwaffe fighter doctrine with characteristic precision. "We built a force of hunters when the Americans built a system of coordination. We celebrated the ace when they eliminated the necessity for aces. We flew as individuals connected by courage. They flew as a network connected by technology. Courage is admirable. Networks are inevitable. Strategic Bombing Survey interview. Adolf Galland, October 1945. His words carried no bitterness, only the exhausted recognition of a professional who had watched industrial modernity render traditional martial virtue tactically obsolete. The human cost of this transformation exceeded comprehension. Over 79,000 American airmen died in the European theater, and tens of thousands of German pilots fell from skies they once dominated. Army Air Forces Statistical Digest, 1945. But the asymmetry in how they died revealed everything about the war's trajectory. American losses, catastrophic in absolute terms, occurred within a system that learned, adapted, and improved with industrial efficiency. German losses accumulated within a structure that couldn't replace what it lost. Not planes, not fuel, but the institutional knowledge and cultural cohesion that had made the Luftwaffe formidable. The Americans built a machine that grew stronger through losses, integrating lessons into training pipelines that produced replacement pilots already fluent in networked warfare. The Germans lost irreplaceable artists in a medium that no longer rewarded artistry. What the Germans truly thought about American pilots by war's end wasn't contempt, or even grudging respect. It was something closer to anthropological bewilderment, the recognition that they had fought an opponent, organized around fundamentally different principles of warfare, principles that matched the realities of industrial-age combat more accurately than 2,000 years of Western military tradition. The Americans hadn't produced better individual warriors. They had rendered the concept of individual warriors strategically meaningless. In the end, the lesson transcended aviation, transcended even warfare itself. Connection defeats isolation. Coordination defeats courage. Systems defeat heroes. The Americans won the sky not because their pilots were braver or their planes faster, but because they understood that modern war is fundamentally a problem of information flow, and whoever communicates most effectively dominates the battle space most completely.